Welcome, welcome. What's going on, everybody? I'm Hasan Piker. Welcome back to Agit Prop. You're joining me live from the epicenter of sin, the den of cultural imperialism. I'm, of course, talking about sunny California, Los Angeles. Joining me today is a very special friend of mine, Daniel 3 Arrows. He will be blessing us with his handsome German face, all the way from Germany, actually, as we talk to him about a variety of different things. Dan is famous for his long and thoughtful and comprehensive think pieces on YouTube on the channel 3 Arrows that notorious center journalist Tim Pool once referred to as an Antifa channel. So we're going to be talking to him about a variety of different things from ACAB, what that statement means, what the historic precedent of that statement is. Why do leftist people hate cops? These are questions that you might have, okay? So we're gonna talk about that, talking about the history of the police force. Then we're gonna talk about some interesting news, specifically in regards to a business roundtable of CEOs saying that they no longer wanna put shareholder interest as their top priority. This is, of course, a drastic change from the greed is good mentality from the 80s. We're also gonna talk about some good news. Johnson & Johnson lost a lawsuit against Oklahoma and now has to pay $500 million to Oklahoma in damages. And then finally, we're gonna get some funny stuff with Bret Stephens and how he has absolutely lost his mind over some Twitter commentary showcasing once again that the right claims to be free speech and claims to be the anti-PC brigade and hates political correctness, but will lose their mind collectively over the first sight of just any sort of pushback whatsoever. But without further ado, what's going on, Dan? How you doing?
Hey, Hasan, I'm doing good. How are things in sunny California?
Not as great as it could be right now. I don't know if you're aware. I don't know if I mean, you don't really watch a lot of Fox News. It might literally be banned in Germany for Tucker Carlson's show and whatnot. But
I watch way too much Fox News. So
you do? Okay,
yeah,
that's true. You and I have actually covered Fox News together in the past.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, specifically Tucker Carlson stuff. But well, I'm really glad that you're here. And I'm really glad that you're joining us. I don't know when you're coming to America, but I'm very excited to be doing this with you. I think we need a lot more BreadTube representation. You have done a tremendous amount of work in regards to fighting back against misinformation created by internet right-wingers like Steven Crowder. One of my favorite videos that you've ever done is the Steven Crowder one on how Nazis are actually socialist. Another one is
classic.
Yeah, another one is like how to escape the alt-right rabbit hole, or how to get sucked into the rabbit hole rather. I think these are very thoughtful and incredibly important pieces that unfortunately now are much more important, especially considering that stochastic terror is growing all around the world. But yeah, once again, thank you for coming on. And I know you studied up for this show because you're diligent like that. So let's get started. Unless you have something specific to say before we do.
Let's just get into it. Thanks for the nice words and thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
to you.
I normally hate having people that are more attractive than me on the show, but we just kidding. All right, let's get started. So nearly 200 executives, including the leaders of Apple, Pepsi, and Walmart, tried this past week on Monday to redefine the role of business in society and how companies are perceived by an increasingly skeptical public. What did they do? They held a business roundtable, which they hold annually. It's a lobbying group of some of the most powerful firms in the country. And in that statement that they released, they said, shareholder value will no longer be held up to the standard it has. We are going to no longer prioritize profits. We are no longer going to prioritize maximizing shareholder value. And we are instead going to focus on community, our employees, and the other businesses that we work with along the way. Now, You might want to believe that, you might not want to believe that, but let me just get right into it. Breaking with decades of long-held corporate orthodoxy, the Business Roundtable issued a statement on the purpose of a corporation, arguing that companies should no longer advance the interests of the shareholder. Instead, the group said they must also invest in their employees, protect the environment, and deal fairly and ethically with their suppliers. Now, this goes against what they had originally said, which in its own articulation of the theory, specifically Milton Friedman's theory that greed is good and that the only social responsibility that a corporation has is to maximize its profits and everything else will be great. And its own articulation of that theory in the official doctrine in 1997 was that the paramount duty of management and boards of directors is to the corporation's shareholders. Each version of its principles published over the last 20 years has stated that corporations exist principally to serve their shareholders. So they're going back on this basically. What do you think about that, Dan? How do you feel? Is change coming?
I don't think so. I think this game. I wouldn't put too much trust in a statement like that. I feel like these companies are kind of feeling the pressure, not only from the left with Sanders and Warren, but also from the right recently, with like this new national conservatism movement popping up, which doesn't even pretend to care about free markets because it's failed so many people. I think this is like maybe just like buying time. I don't think that these companies will do anything that will make them less profitable or less competitive unless they're forced to do so.
Yeah. Of course, and I think that's precisely what they're terrified by. If you watch CNBC or if you watch any of these like business-centered, if you watch any of the business-centered news coverage, one really interesting thing I've found is that they never mention Bernie Sanders. They only talk about Elizabeth Warren. I don't know if that's deliberate or not, but even when they're talking about Elizabeth Warren, they talk about her in such fearful terms, and they are terrified of another specific thing that they bring up all the time, which is 50% of millennials no longer favor capitalism over socialism, and they're like, how do we change this? How do we change this reality? We're freaking out. And I think finally, because of social media and because of just genuinely how terrible the economic situation has gotten to, people are finally starting to realize that this is a gigantic problem and corporations are at the very least paying lip service to the idea. I don't think this is real change. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's gonna, like real change is never gonna come from the top down. Real change is never gonna come unless we drastically change the profit motive and drastically change the outlook and how much power the workforce has, obviously. But as Darren Walker, a Pepsi board member, said, the ideology of shareholder primacy has contributed to the economic inequality we see today in America. The Chicago School of Economics is so embedded in the psyche of investors and legal theory and the CEO mindset, overcoming that won't be easy. Like they're throwing their godfather, and the Chicago School of Economics that has been like the main theory going forward since the 80s and 90s that focused on like corporate raiders and greed is good and cut back on all of these different things, including like philanthropy budgets in corporations and their service to their communities. They're trying to change that now, but I don't think it's going to be real change unless it's change brought about by either a regulatory force, as you mentioned, or potentially by the workers themselves in an effort to democratize the workforce. Dan, not to throw you on the spot here, but one thing that I wanted to ask you specifically is, I mean, you're a big history buff, right? You love history. You cover a lot of things from a historical perspective, and I wanted to ask you, I mean, how has this worked in the past? Hasn't big businesses almost always sided with fascism? If I'm mistaken, and I'm comparing us to like 1932, I would say, maybe like 1934, 1935. Like that's the era I'm looking towards now. Didn't big businesses and even liberals originally assume that fascism was just a more muscular way to enforce the capitalist dynamic at a time when the other side, which was Marxism or like labor organizing, at a time when that was considered to be much more threatening to the established status quo?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I would agree to that. Maybe I wouldn't say like we're at the point of, or America is at the point of 1932, but despite like Adolf Hitler, for instance, not having many big industrialists under his wing during his rise, except for the Thyssen Company, as you said, when the rubber meets the road, an ideology that is as destructive as fascism, is still preferable to something like socialism or any kind of ideology that expropriates the wealth, than an ideology which leaves it in the hand of the big industrialists. So yeah, that's basically the reason why so many conservatives and the Center Party, etc., preferred like fascism over the alternative, which was communism at the time.
Yeah, and that is something that I'm genuinely fearful of. Outside of, I mean, look, I don't care about the ideological reasons for why we should be pushing for more labor organizing or whatever. I look at it completely from a pragmatic perspective. I think that any sort of profit-centered business is obviously not going to have the same kind of longevity that a business that centers around its workers will have, or demonstrably has had, if you look at successful cooperative corporations like the Mondragon Corporation. But my focus is like the way that we have concentrated wealth and power in this country and under the current system, the current economic organization, has gotten to a level that has fostered undeniable economic inequality, so much so that even the members at the top, the main beneficiaries of the structure, are forced to identify this issue and are forced to, at the very least, pay lip service to it. Now, I'm not alone in being skeptical about this. Bernie Sanders also said, I don't believe what they're saying for a moment. If they were sincere, they would talk about raising the minimum wage in this country to a living wage, the need for the rich and powerful to pay their fair share of taxes. Now, I 100% agree with that sentiment, because one of the things that they did not mention is CEO compensation, or the compensation structure that exclusively centers around exclusively centers around the maximization of shareholder value, the fiduciary responsibility, the fact that this is like embedded into our legal structure, even that this is the main priority, and it's usually often used as a cop-out. Whenever a corporation or whenever a CEO is held responsible for the actions of their corporation, they'll always say, hey, I did this for my shareholders. I had to maximize shareholder value. And but for some reason, the Business Roundtable, which is comprised of some of the most powerful CEOs, are not taking any legal steps, or are not taking any steps to pressure the government to potentially write out new rules and regulations to hold corporations accountable for these sorts of actions, especially actions that harm the public, or decisions that they make that actively harm the planet, for example. Anyway, but let's move on, unless you have any additional thoughts on this, to the second thing, which is a more positive story.
I mean, like, even if something comes to fruition on that front, like, I don't know, more maternity leave or benefits for employees, this is never going to be done out of like CEOs saying, well, let's be a bit more humanitarian. But these are just things to get a leg up on their competitors, to get more skilled workers to be more competitive. So yeah, it's always going to be done within that framework and never out of like humanitarian impulses.
Yeah, well, obviously, if look, this is something I ask libertarians all the time, which is like, look, if you were so magnanimous, if you wanted to help the people out of the kindness of your heart, then why aren't you redistributing profits in a more equitable fashion? Why are you extracting surplus value from the labor of your workers and not necessarily allowing them to have a say in the way that profit gets distributed, whether it be marketing budgets or whatever? Or if you genuinely cared, if philanthropy, individual philanthropy, were to solve all these problems, well, we currently have a lot of problems. Where is the philanthropy? Where, like, who's stopping these 501c3s from acting in this way to solve income inequality, or to solve global poverty, or to solve food insecurity, even in a country like America where we have an abundance of food, right? Globally, when we have an abundance of food production and food supply, but there are still 8 million people, give or take, dying every year of famine-related diseases. So obviously, this sort of philanthropic endeavors, don't actually work. We need systemic change, wide sweeping systemic changes. All right, but let's move on to our second story to talk about some positive news. Oklahoma recently had a lawsuit, a very famous lawsuit against Johnson & Johnson that they won. And now Johnson & Johnson has to pay $500 million in damages to Oklahoma. An Oklahoma judge on Monday found Johnson & Johnson and its subsidiaries helped fuel the state's opiate drug crisis and ordered the consumer products giant to pay $572 million to help abate the problem in the coming years. Now, of course, the original amount that they were asking for was much higher. The amount fell far short of the $17 billion judgment that Oklahoma had sought to pay for addiction treatment, drug courts, and other services. It said it would need over the next 20 years to repair the damage done by the opioid epidemic. And if you consider the profits that Johnson & Johnson have made, that is also in the upwards of multiple billions. So they could definitely pay for this. But finally, in his ruling, Judge Thad Balkman wrote that Johnson & Johnson had promulgated false, misleading, and dangerous marketing campaigns that had caused exponentially increasing rates of addiction, overdose deaths, and babies born exposed to opioids. But yeah, finally some good news, especially considering that more often than not, whenever cases like this happen, they usually settle out of court, which means that there is almost never a guilty verdict. There is never an admission of guilt on behalf of the pharmaceutical corporations. I believe two pharmaceutical corporations were also sued previously that settled out of court and paid damages, but did not admit to any wrongdoing or any guilt. But Johnson & Johnson is notorious for taking these sorts of court cases all the way to trial, and they have mentioned that they're going to try to appeal this decision. But so far, this is good news considering that there are around 2,000 additional court cases similar to this one against Johnson & Johnson and other big pharmaceutical corporations like, oh my God, I'm blanking out right now, Teva and numerous others like Purdue that could potentially have to pay additional legal damages all around the country. So yeah, what do you think about that, Dan?
I mean, it's great, obviously. That's a bunch of money. But considering that, like I've seen some estimates of what Johnson & Johnson makes of OxyContin, and it's roughly about like 10 billion a year. And Oklahoma State has said that they have expenses of about 1 billion a year just because of the opioid crisis. So hopefully their appeal won't be successful, and hopefully this will spark a wave of judgments being made similar in other states.
Yeah, and by the way, look, originally I wasn't even thinking about covering the story because I was like, there is no way Johnson & Johnson would be foolish enough to take this to trial, right? Like there's just no way if they didn't know that they would absolutely slam dunk win this court case. And they were foolish and they lost, which is surprising, but also again, just a little bit of positivity in all of the dark news that we cover all the time. And look, for me, the reason why I want to talk about this, the reason why I wanted to cover this is not necessarily just to draw a direct line between corporate profits and how that has caused the opiate crisis. Obviously, Johnson & Johnson manufactures the substance that other pharmaceutical corporations use on like OxyContin and whatnot. And because of that, even though they weren't like even directly selling opiates, they went to more than I think 150,000 doctors. Or they went to doctors more than 150,000 times to push for OxyContin, regardless of their knowledge that this was genuinely a harmful substance. They hid certain potential negative side effects. They knew that this was significantly addictive, and yet they still pushed for it because they wanted to make more money. And this goes directly against what most capitalists advocate for, which is that profit always fosters innovation. Now, there are other famous cases from different parts of the country where other pharmaceutical corporations have failed to dump more money into their research and development of specific drugs because they're running out of their patents. Their patents are about to expire and it's no longer going to be profitable to the tune of billions, and it will only be profitable when generic manufacturers come in and start making that drug for a much cheaper price, and they'll just completely throw away potential research and development opportunities, showcasing once again that especially when it comes to healthcare, especially when it comes to drugs and saving people's lives, the profit motive isn't necessarily the most important factor What's up, Dan? You're not Dan Three Arrows, but Dan, my producer. He's waving his hand. What's going on?
Yeah, that's not going to be confusing at all. No, I just wanted to point out, and we're having this whole conversation, that Johnson & Johnson's stock actually went up today on the news that they received a lower fine than expected. So like, to your broader point of how these companies sort of operate and exist pricing in the fact they're going to end up killing lots of people, shows that we need to fundamentally rethink our pharmaceutical medical system in the United States and rethink the amount of power that they have in our structures.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of insane to consider that, but that's how it works. Boeing with like Boeing when one of their famous planes started crashing. That led to the deaths of hundreds of people. They had already factored that in. Similar with car companies, like factoring in and how much they have to pay off in damages to make sure that their bottom line isn't hurt when the foreseeable conclusion of a lack of regulation in any specific field ends up taking the lives of thousands of people. So, when you put it into those terms, it's kind of still laughable that the Business Roundtable in the previous story was talking about how they're no longer going to maximize their profits, because that kind of this idea is so powerful. It's built into every single one of our institutions that legitimizes that the profit motive is the imperative, is the main function of a corporation, and is the thing that most corporations should be focusing on. And that is a self-regulating idea when it absolutely is not. Or at the very least, it leads to less than great outcomes historically and even right now. But yeah, Dan, did you have any additional stuff that you want to talk about in regards to this?
No, not really. It's just like, it's almost as if the profit motive shouldn't exist when it comes to something like healthcare.
Yeah. Well, that's, you and I are certainly in agreement on that, friend. Okay, well, let's move on to our next story then. This is gonna be a long one and a heady one, so I'm just gonna get right into it. First and foremost, Dan, give me a thumbs up if I'm allowed to say the B word on live show. Okay, I am. All right. The reason why I asked that question is because the next segment that we are going to be looking into is ACAB, AKA all cops are bastards. Now, what is ACAB, you might say? You might have seen this around the internet or in graffitis or on walls, or you might have heard, like, I don't know, your like favorite artist talking about it. Well, ACAB is an acronym for all cops are bastards. It's a slogan and written catchphrase in graffiti, tattoos, and other imagery to protest unethical behavior and the police in general. But why? Are all cops bad? Are all cops bastards? Well, I thought it was just a couple bad apples and not the whole basket. That's what they always say. What about the few bad apples? It's just, let's not attack the entire bunch. Well, first of all, one, a couple bad apples does end up spoiling the entire basket. And two, in this circumstance, the entire basket is broken and it ends up ruining the apples. So it's the exact opposite. So for us to take a look at this, I wanted to go back in time. Let's talk about it. Why do lefties attack police officers quite frequently, and not attack like physically? I mean, criticize police officers and the institution of policing. Let's get started with the first publicly funded organized police force, which is in Boston, with officers on duty full time. And it was created in Boston in 1839. Boston was a large shipping commercial center, and businesses had been hiring people to protect their property and safeguard the transport of goods from the port of Boston to other places. These merchants came up with a way to save money by transferring to the cost of maintaining a police force to citizens by arguing that it was for the collective good. Before that, police forces were not organized. They were, as a matter of fact, comprised of night watchmen, and night watchmen were basically, ironically actually, just made up of thugs and scoundrels and people that were forced into participating in the night watchmen, and that they would just fall asleep on the job for the most part, and that they had some constables that were elected in certain areas that would control the night watchmen to ensure that they were actually following whatever kind of rules they had set in those towns. But even before that, the first formal slave patrol in the South had been created in Carolina colonies in 1704. Now this was another function of the police force. During the Civil War, the military became the primary form of law enforcement in the South, but during Reconstruction, Reconstruction, many local sheriffs functioned in a way analogous to the earlier slave patrols, enforcing segregation and the disenfranchisement of freed slaves. So just like in the North, and also in the South, there were economic reasons as to why this force was created, why it was seen as a necessity, but they didn't center around shipping interests in the South. They centered around the repossession of capital. In this instance, capital being actual human beings. Slaves, of course, is what I'm referencing. That came here that were brought here in 1619, and they numbered 20 African slaves landing in Jamestown, and then that number would, of course, skyrocket up to 500,000. But yeah. So in the 19th century and beyond that, however, the police force was tasked with maintaining the public order, which more often than not corresponded to the interests of business owners or racial and ethnocentric fears. This was controlling the immigrant population and, most importantly, controlling the crowds that would form, like labor organizing, which was very militant at the time. Businesses in the late 19th century had both connection to politicians and an image of the kinds of people most likely to go on strike and disrupt their workforce. So it's no coincidence by the late 1880s, all major US cities had police forces because of fears of labor union organizers and of large waves of Catholic, Irish, Italian, German, and Eastern European immigrants who looked and acted differently from the people who had dominated the cities before. And this drove a call for the preservation of law and order, or at least the version of it promoted by dominant interests. Now, having said that, there's another element that I want to ask Dan here specifically about, considering that the police have not only protected capital interests, but sometimes has behaved in an almost violent fashion, not almost violent fashion, behaved in a violent fashion in which they execute community leaders and try to squash organized labor or any sort of like anarchist movements, and specifically Rosa Luxemburg and I think the Weimar Republic would be a great example for you to for me to throw this subject over to you.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, and in addition to that, when you just were talking about cities like Boston. And organized police force being very much created in the interest of merchants and capital owners, is that it was around this time that this idea sprung up of crime being a problem connected to the dangerous classes, so immigrants, poorer people, folk like that. And this kind of prevails to this day, that crime control is always seen in the framework of social control, because it's always associated with bad individuals and not with a social environment. That's basically where that comes from. When it comes to the police being an oppressive force throughout history in Europe, well, like if you want to wield power, you always need an executive branch to do that. And this police force being the defenders of like the capital owners is very much, I would say, like a view through the American keyhole, because in places like Germany, for instance, the police was a force for the monarchy. Then after it was incorporated into the Weimar Republic, and then after it became like a terrorizing oppressive force under the Nazis. And then in the East, it was also an oppressive force under a socialist dictatorship. So basically the police is always like the executive branch of state power, not strictly capital, but in the United States, that's mostly where the power lies. So yeah, when it comes to Rosa Luxemburg and stuff like that, I wouldn't really compare that to a situation like Frankhampton, for instance.
Yeah.
Because like Rosa Luxemburg, like there was an insane amount of violence going on in Weimar Germany at the time, like not really comparable to the civil rights movement. So that's a whole different story. But of course, advocates for social change have always been the target for existing authority, and the arm to execute that force was always the police.
Yeah, and this is at the heart of our criticism, especially when considering how the police force still functions in a similar fashion to this day. I know you mentioned the civil rights movement, but I want to briefly go back to another part of history, especially when class conflict was a significant problem. When class conflict roiled late 19th century American cities like Chicago, which experienced major strikes and riots in 1867, 1877, 1886, and 1894. In each of these upheavals, the police attacked strikers with extreme violence. Even in 1877 and 1894, the US Army played a bigger role in ultimately repressing the working class. In the aftermath of these movements, the police increasingly presented themselves as a thin blue line protecting civilization, and by which of course they meant bourgeois civilization from the disorder of the working class. This ideology of order that developed in the late 19th century echoes down to today, except that today, poor Black and Latino people are the main threat rather than immigrant workers. And by the way, of course, immigrant workers referencing like Irish and the German immigrants and the other immigrants that came after, because right now there is an analogy here that even that pertains to immigrant workers, undocumented immigrant workers that exist in this country right now, and how ICE, which is again another arm of the state that enacts a tremendous amount of violence on specific minority groups in this country, is operating at the behest of capital interests and the interests of not only the corporations but also, as you mentioned, the state. A very recent example is with the chicken farm that was targeted by ICE after they were forced to pay out multiple millions in damages to their employees because of sexual abuse and like numerous other problems that were occurring. It was a Coke farm, but it wasn't like the Cokes. Like no, I'm not talking about the petroleum Coke, but Coke, the farm that was targeted recently. So this is currently ongoing and this is still happening. And the reason why I wanted to mention this is because I think there is a misconception here that gets publicized quite frequently. And I think like even like Black Lives Matter protesters understand this reality that police don't necessarily just attack Black people, or they aren't necessarily just harmful to Black people and Black communities, which they absolutely are, but also to poor people in general. And for some reason, you don't really get to see this message on mainstream media. So I wanted to dispel some of this with actual facts about where police operate, even in this day and age, and how police operate in this day and age, and what the victims of their actions are, specifically police brutality, regardless of the fact that racial disparities are absolutely present in our criminal justice system, from policing all the way to sentencing. We know that already. But I'm trying to talk about a part that mainstream media fails to consider, which is socioeconomic disparities between communities that experience police shootings and more police presence in general. In 2015, data journalist Zaid Jilani looked at police killings in the first half of the year for Alternet. He found that 95% of the police killings occurred in neighborhoods with median family incomes under $100,000. He also found that there were no killings in neighborhoods with a median family income of $200,000 or above. Another study also found that America's poorest neighborhoods and neighborhoods with the greatest number of non-white residents are the most likely to see deadly police encounters. The only significant exception was that in the country's whitest neighborhoods, Black Americans were disproportionately likely to be killed in police interactions. Do you have any additional stuff to say about that, Dan, or should we move on?
Yeah, we can move on, but I mean, you're probably going to get to this, but this is such a layered problem, not only poverty, but also just the vast amount of guns that exists in the United States, because the police also disproportionately commits violence against poor people in Germany, for instance, but they are less trigger happy because, of course, in Germany, way less people have guns. For instance, the United States has about 4 times as many people living there as Germany, but in 2015, the amount of people killed was 100 times as high as in a comparable Western democracy.
Wow, that's wild. Wait, doesn't Switzerland have a gigantic problem with this?
It's with gun violence?
So Switzerland is oftentimes the country that most gun advocates point to, where they say, well, this country has a lot of guns. Look at Switzerland, what's going on? Well, first of all, the rules and regulations surrounding gun ownership in Switzerland are what American gun rights advocates would consider totalitarian. Okay,
most definitely.
There is a tremendous amount of regulation. You can't just there's no open carry. You can't even transport your weapon in your car if the magazine is on the weapon itself. You can't like brandish your weapon or run around with it. You can only take it to the hunting range. Now there are a lot of people in the country that also own guns. It's a lot higher. There's mandatory military service as well. And there are a lot of civilians who have firearms on top of that. However, Switzerland also has a higher rate of gun violence in comparison to other European nations that have lower gun owning, lower rates of gun ownership. And part of that, of course, is this gun violence, of course, is like suicides. But again, yet another testament to the fact that if there are more guns, there is going to be more gun violence. But you're right. Something that you mentioned is the poor communities being heavily, poor communities in every community in America being heavily armed, and this being used as a threat, or this usually is used as a counterpoint as to why the police need to be militarized. But that is a gigantic problem in and of itself, because when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Now, I want to give 9 important points about police brutality right now. American police have killed more than 9,000 civilians since 9/11. That's a gigantic problem. We're the #1, okay? It doesn't matter if you're a Republican, doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, like this is a huge problem. 2, American cops shoot and kill far more than their foreign counterparts. Cities across the US face accusations of police abuse. There is no reliable data on officer-involved deaths, and that is by design, for the record. Every comprehensive data list that we look at is actually citizens and nonprofits putting this stuff together, compiling this from local news reports and also the FBI database as well. But like for the most part, there isn't any sort of super reliable, super comprehensive data set that we can point to. Because the government refuses to track this stuff. 5, police can use deadly force if they merely perceive a threat, and cops are almost never prosecuted or convicted for wrongful use of force. That's changing because of Black Lives Matter, because of body cameras being issued at every precinct. Murders of on-duty police officers are near record lows, contrary to popular opinion. Most people assume that this is like the most dangerous job that you can hold as being a police officer, and that they're constantly putting their lives on the line. I'm not saying it's an easy job. It's not an easy job to be a police officer. But also, it's by far not the most dangerous job you could hold on to, or the most dangerous job where like everyone's looking out to get you and everyone's trying to kill you. Federal government sends spare military equipment to local police in the government surplus programs that I'm going to briefly talk about in a second. And finally, the police must repair their relationship to the communities that they serve through a practice known as community policing. But even beyond that, I think we need to have more accountability. We need to change the entire legal structure that protects police officers when they merely perceive a threat, or when they merely perceive whoever is running away from them as a threat to other people. They can gun down individuals and not even suffer the consequences of that action, where essentially they're playing judge, jury, and executioner. There is no innocent until proven guilty. There is just, in this moment's notice, I felt threatened, and so I shot this person and I murdered them. And that's not something that we should be promoting, and that's not something that we should accept here in America, where we are supposed to have a democracy and that everyone is supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. But yeah, as you were saying, I want to talk about the militarization of police as well, and how that's led to devastating outcomes. And I want to ask you about Germany as well. Like, German police are never as militarized as the American police, right? Like even most localities with like, I don't know, 50,000 people have a SWAT team at this point, Special Weapons and Tactics, which is literally militarized police.
Yeah, it's nowhere near as severe as in the United States. I mean, German police is militarized to a certain degree, but that only really shows at large-scale events like the G20 summit in Hamburg, for instance, where you saw a lot of that. But besides that, the task of community welfare is much more emphasized for German police, I would say, than American police. For instance, when a German police officer fires a shot and doesn't even have to hit anybody, there's always an investigation if that shot was warranted, no matter the outcome. So I think, as you just said, more accountability would be like the first step to mitigate all these deaths.
Yeah, I mean, look, the entire system here is broken. Okay, like the entire system, all the way to accountability, is broken. We have the police investigating other police. Like obviously that's not going to be, and there's zero accountability outside of that. Like there has to be some form of like, there has to be civilians that are also taking a part of this investigation, like community leaders or elected officials that are elected for this specific reason, that have to play a significant role in these sorts of investigations, especially considering we're paying for the salaries of the police force, right? And that's what's always shocking to me is like, well, okay, like we're paying for these people's salaries, and then they essentially present themselves as an occupying force in these sorts of communities when I don't want them to go around and shoot random black teenagers or whatever, or even like shoot white, like poor white people either. Like that's terrible, and it should not be the way that policing occurs, but unfortunately it still is to this day. Look, there is another element to this. You might have seen this before. Whenever people talk about cops, the number that a lot of people throw up there is 40%. You might be trying to figure out, what does 40% mean? Well, the 40% number, whenever people bring up when they're talking about cops, is a reference to I believe early 1990 or 1990 study that found that 40% of police officers' families experience domestic violence. Now, this was an explosive study conducted a long time ago, and I admit, since then no additional conclusive studies have been conducted on this matter, and it's been notoriously difficult to find additional studies on this matter, considering once again we go back to the same problem of police officers are investigating themselves under these circumstances whenever a domestic abuse instance is logged, and do with that information what you will, I guess. Would you have anything to say about that, Dan?
I wasn't even aware that was a real study. I thought that was just like a Chapo Trap House meme. I wasn't aware that was actually real.
No, that's where that comes from, though. That's where that meme comes from. Like whenever people say like 40%, they're referencing that, and of course that's multiple times over the domestic violence rate, even at that time, and certainly now. Yeah. So that is definitely a statistic. Now, the reason why that's an important statistic to mention, regardless of how old it is because, I mean, let's say it was drastically reduced, right? Let's say that this domestic violence was drastically reduced in the police force, or let's say it was reduced across the board, like it was in civilian life. Ultimately, that's still a tremendous number of people in the police force that by law should no longer have weapons. Because as we all know, committing domestic abuse is one of the telltale red flag signs that you could potentially commit violent acts with that weapon down the line if you own a weapon. So maybe we should hold our law enforcement officers accountable to the same standards that we hold American citizens. In which case, we would be de-arming a lot of police officers all around the country. And that's why I think that's a significant statistic, regardless of from what time period it's from. Okay, but on to some more fun news, all right? I wanna tie this around with some more fun stuff to talk about. We are going to talk about New York Times opinion columnist Bret Stephens. Now, you might also know him as the guy that kind of looks like Beto O'Rourke. Can you guys pull up the photo of Bret Stephens really quickly? I just want people to see this handsome fellow right here. Now, I mean, Bret I don't know. I don't know where to begin. He does look a lot like Beto O'Rourke though. I've always found that rather odd. Bret Stephens is notorious for being a anti-PC. Oh guys, you guys are so triggered. You guys are all a bunch of snowflakes. You need to man up, kind of conservative, and an opinion columnist in the New York Times that makes allegedly a six-figure salary for crying about how soft millennials are, and all this other fun stuff that represents the American, the broad spectrum. What? Oh yeah, okay. Oh shoot, sorry. Okay. All right. We're gonna talk about Bret Stephens right now, but first, let's throw the graphic for the segment. All right, that's our Please Tread on Me segment that I forgot to use the graphics for, which is why I was reprimanded just now. On our Please Tread on Me segment this week, we're gonna be talking about Bret Stephens, New York Times opinion columnist and Beto O'Rourke lookalike. Can you guys throw up that up? Oh, thank you. Now, Bret Stephens yesterday was met with some backlash because a George Washington University professor by the name of Dave Karff on Twitter said, the bedbugs are a metaphor, the bedbugs are Bret Stephens, in regards to bedbugs being in the New York Times newsroom. Now, originally this tweet from Dave Karff was, I think it got approximately like 8 likes or something. He's just some random George Washington University professor. But then Bret Stephens, who was apparently name searching himself because there's no other way for him to find this tweet because he wasn't mentioned, went off and fired off a strongly worded email to Dave Karff, okay? And CC'd the provost. Remember, this is Bret Stephens, who is like, everyone's too triggered all the time, everyone's a snowflake. But now he's asking for this guy to essentially be fired or reprimanded. Now let's take a look at that email really quickly. I'm gonna try to read it as best as I can because like my eyesight's terrible. Dear Dr. Karff, someone just pointed out oh God, there's no way to read this. Okay, I'm giving up on trying to read it. It's like way too tiny. I don't know what you guys did. I don't know why you didn't post the actual letter on here, but whatever. He wrote an email to the provost and CC'd him. Here are some things that Bret Stephens has said in the past, like in the New York Times opinion section in October 20th, 2017. There are no safe spaces. Bret Stephens on the University of Chicago's essential contribution to the debate on free speech. Bret Stephens also wrote another article for the New York Times, Free Speech and the Necessity of Discomfort. Bret Stephens even went so far as to defend a columnist, David A. French, when David A. French was defending Tucker Carlson's words, as he called Iraqis primitive monkeys. Bret Stephens said, our nation cannot maintain its culture of free speech if we continue to reward those who seek to destroy careers rather than rebut ideas. I was in the crosshairs of Tucker Carlson recently and numerous other people and the right. And let me tell you, they don't care, okay? They don't care about free speech. They're not principled free speech defenders. They just want to be able to say like the N-word and whatever they want without any sort of scrutiny from the left. That's all it is, okay? They cry whenever they're met with an opinion that they can't rebut, that they find to be distasteful. Yeah, so that's the fun story here. What do you think, Dan? That's our bootlicker of the week.
I don't know what to say about a guy like Bret Stephens. Like, imagine you're working for the New York Times and you're in between writing a column arguing for, I don't know, bombing Palestine again, and a different column, what he wrote was called The Pirate Nation, about how the US should sink Iran's navy. And it's totally self-evident that you should do that, and it's totally fine. But then you name search yourself on Twitter and find a guy tweeting that you're a bedbug, which didn't even have retweets or anything, and writing an email telling he should get fired. Like, it's so amazing. I don't know what to say.
Well, I mean, look, other campus conservatives, other famous campus conservatives like Dershowitz, the Dersh man, they love freedom of speech as long as, like you mentioned, it doesn't pertain to like boycott, divest, and sanctions on Israel. Like these are, Barry Weiss is another example of this. Like, these are notorious free speech, are you triggered liberals defenders, right? They're supposed to be these like reasonable centrist opinions on New York Times that apparently so many Americans need to hear from. And yet, when it comes to, like you said, when it comes to like any sort of like Palestinian criticism of Israel, they're like, oh, hold on, we got to get these people fired immediately. Both Alan Dershowitz and Barry Weiss have engaged in this. So, you know, there is a power dynamic there. It's totally acceptable when you say, let's say the Iraqi invasion that led to, and the Iraqi sanctions that led to 500,000 Iraqi civilians was well deserved. Let's say that that's a statement that you make on national television. Or you say Iran deserves to be wiped off the map, which is something that Tucker Carlson has said on Fox News. That's not considered to be controversial. But anything else, any other sort of criticism of American policy or anti-imperialist notion that you might have will immediately be met with a level of charitability that you would never ever offer to your ideological allies. These guys are not fair, they're not balanced, and they're charlatans of the highest order. And I love this. I'm gonna look it up right now. I need to read you guys this email because it is so insane, okay? I can't read it from that graphic, but if you pull up that graphic again, okay, can you read it, Dan? Here, I'll throw it to Dan. Dan will read it.
Yeah, I got it. I can do this in perfect professorial jargon. Dear Dr. Karp, someone just posted out a tweet you wrote about me, calling me a quote bedbug. And I'm amazed about the things supposedly decent people are prepared to say about other people they've never met on Twitter. I think you've set a new standard. I would welcome the opportunity for you to come to my home, meet my wife and kids, and talk to us for a few minutes, and then call me a bedbug to my face. That would take some genuine courage and intellectual integrity on your part. I promise to be courteous no matter what you have to say. Maybe it will make you feel better about yourself. Please consider this a standing invitation. You are more than welcome to bring your significant other for whatever weird shit he's into. Cordially, Bret Stephens.
Can we just take a moment to just appreciate how horny Bret Stephens is? Like, is this the way that Bret Stephens actually, this is the only way that he can engage in swinging, where he's like, hey, come to my house, bring your wife or your significant other, it's okay, and just tell me that I'm a bedbug. Tell me directly to my face that I am a bedbug. There is no other way that I can get off anymore. This is the only way. I hate it. I hate that this is the only way that I can just make me feel something, okay? Oh, that's basically the tone of voice in this beautifully worded, strongly worded letter to the provost and also Professor Karp from Bret Stephens. Again, notable conservative intellectual who is very upset about liberals on college campuses and SJWs being triggered by everything. Oh God, I can't get over that. I can't get over that letter. And now the other part of this equation is now he's gonna have a speaking gig. You know what I mean? Now, the provost, Forrest Maltzman, replied to Bret Stephens and said, thanks for getting in touch. As you know, as an academic, Professor Karp speaks for himself and does not take direction from me. His opinion are his own. Our commitment to academic freedom and free speech are integral to GW's mission. I see on Twitter that you invited him to your home. I would like to take this opportunity to invite you to come to our campus to speak about civil discourse in the digital age. Please reach out to me if this is of interest. Like, even when these guys fail, they fail upwards. Like, how is this possible? It's just so frustrating that it's so frustrating that I don't know. I mean, like Marcus Lamont loses his job. What?
Is he going to hold a speech about how he's not a bedbug? Like, yeah, jumping off that controversy.
It's just. It's the asymmetry of like intellectuals and speakers of color in comparison to those who instead of speaking truth to power, benefit from the status quo and try to try to provide like institutional legitimacy to the established order. And Bret Stephens is a perfect beneficiary of this system. If you look at any number of academics like that have lost their speaking gigs, from Norm Finkelstein to even Noam Chomsky losing out on numerous media appearances for their dedicated anti-imperialist stance or for their like heterodox way of like talking about the Israeli conflict and numerous other things. Like, these people lose their jobs when they speak out of pocket or speak out of line. When Bret Stephens gets upset because you called him a bedbug, like to your friends or whatever. This is literally the equivalent of like you on the street saying to your friend, "Hey man, Bret Stephens is kind of a bedbug, right?" And then him overhearing it because like other people reported it back to him, and then trying to get you fired from your job. Like, it's just preposterous that this dude is still failing upwards, even in this dynamic.
Yeah,
annoying.
Another great example of that is when who you just mentioned, Norman Finkelstein, exposed Alan Dershowitz as a plagiarist, like live on air. And what came about that was that Finkelstein was actually denied his tenure after Dershowitz sent a bunch of letters to his university, and nothing ever happened to Dershowitz for that.
Yeah, because those who defend positions of power rather than speak truth to power, even when it's hard to hear, will always or have always historically suffered the consequences of that. And it's incredibly frustrating, but luckily we have the internet. Luckily we have you guys. And luckily we have brave truth tellers like Dan here as well, doing their part, doing their best, and we can continue doing what we do, regardless of whether or not we get mainstream credibility, or regardless of the litany of death threats that one individual in particular may or may not be receiving currently, and threats of their family members getting doxxed. Who knows who I'm referencing? Anyway, what? All right, well, let's throw to Bret Stephens, who's crying on television, who was given an opportunity to go on TV and cry about being called a bedbug.
I'm going to be careful with my words because I know these are going to be examined carefully. So I think Twitter brings out the worst in its users. It tends to bring out the worst in its users. And yesterday, a professor at George Washington University described me as a bedbug or a metaphorical bedbug, just in the context of the New York Times having a bedbug problem in our building. And I think that kind of rhetoric is dehumanizing and totally unacceptable, no matter where it comes from. So I wrote him a personal email. I didn't go to Twitter. I wrote him a personal email, which I think was very civil, saying that I didn't appreciate it, that I would welcome him to come to my home in New York, meet with my family, and see if he would call me a bedbug to my face, because a lot of the things people say on social media aren't the things they're really prepared to say in one-on-one interactions.
Look at him trying to make it seem like he has any sort of like intellectual integrity behind him literally saying, come to my house, you won't, coward. Come to my house and say that to my face, dude. I'll beat you up. Like, that's basically that, okay? And it's lovely. What a lovely situation in which someone gets called a bedbug and then they are afforded one of the largest platforms on the planet still to this day, so they can make a case for how being called a bedbug is exactly the same as like a genocide in Myanmar. That's how it started, when they called the Muslims there bedbugs. You know, that's the way that this started.
I can't wait for his next column.
Yeah.
The New York Times opinion section brings out the worst in Bret Stephens. No, not the other way around.
Yeah. It's just, oh God, I'm so frustrated with this story. But most so, like I said, I'm just so insanely frustrated with the flagrant hypocrisy demonstrated by anyone who claims that they are not a triggered snowflake and they do that like PC police and politically correct culture is a bane on freedom of speech in this country, when they themselves so freely curb back free speech and so freely attack it in a vicious fashion. And in a lot of these instances, especially before social media exposed a lot of these frauds for exactly who they are, they would be able to get away with it because other people in positions of power in these other institutions also wanted to maintain a relationship with a New York Times opinion columnist like Bret Stephens. So, oof. Just, God damn it, dude. So
this was supposed to be the fun part, dude.
Yeah, I know. It's supposed to be the fun part, but I'm personally going through some stuff, so I could not cover the story in the humorous fashion that it was designated to be covered.
I understand.
Anyway, and that'll be all. Thank you, Dan. Where can we find you thank you for coming on. Seriously, this was awesome.
Yeah, no problem. You can find me on 3 Arrows on YouTube or _Dan Arrows on Twitter.
All right, and Dan also streams on Twitch as well, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
Damn, you're forgetting.
Numerical 3 Arrows.
Yeah,
Hope
also
to see you
at
back
3
there
Arrows.
soon.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you so much for coming on, Dan. We really appreciate you. And thank you guys for watching. Next episode of Agitprop is gonna be behind a paywall with ContraPoints, Natalie Wynn, famous BreadTube YouTube creator, just like Dan Arrows here. We're going to be talking about a variety of different issues, and that actually is going to be the last Agitprop episode for this duration. This was supposed to be a trial period, and it's been lovely, and I'm really excited for this. So if you guys want to watch that behind a paywall, you're gonna have to go to tyt.com/agitprop and join TYT membership. It's only $5 a month, and it greatly helps us, and it's one way that you can tell Cenk and everyone over at TYT, hey, we like Hasan. We like the shows that he's making. We want to continue in facilitating the creation of this show. I think this sort of leftist voice is an absolute necessity on TYT. So there you go. And I still don't have a call out thing to say whenever I'm ending the show. But yeah, see you on Friday. Bye, everybody.